Welcome! You're about to hear a story that stretches across the entire arc of human civilization, a story older than writing, older than cities, older than kings. Tonight, in a quiet voice and an unhurried rhythm, we'll explore one of the most persistent, complex, and misunderstood aspects of human life. It is a story that winds through temples and taverns, palaces and alleyways, from the sacred rituals of ancient goddesses to the neon lights of modern red light districts. A story not about scandal or shame, but about human behavior, our needs, our systems, our contradictions. So settle in, let your eyes rest, and let your mind drift gently through time, as we take a slow, careful journey through the history of what many have called the world's oldest profession. For as long as human beings have gathered in communities, there are hints that intimate favors have been exchanged for goods or protection. It's often said that prostitution is the world's oldest profession, though of course hunting and gathering came first, and we cannot truly know what job was the very first. Even so, evidence of prostitution as an occupation reaches back at least to the dawn of recorded history. One of the earliest written references comes from ancient Mesopotamia around 2400 BCE, where cuneiform tablets describe women servicing men in a temple complex. In the Sumerian city of Uruk, the temple of the goddess Ishtar housed a hierarchy of such women. Some were sacred specialists who performed ritual acts of intimacy only within the temple's inner sanctum. Others lived on the temple grounds and catered to pilgrims in its courtyards. And a third, lower class, dwelt at the temple but also ventured into the streets to find customers. These temple-affiliated women were not seen as wives or ordinary women. They occupied a distinct social role sanctioned by religion. Outside the temples, independent prostitutes, called harimtu in Akkadian, also existed, plying their trade in taverns or marketplaces. Early Mesopotamian law codes show surprising concern for their welfare. The Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, c. 1750 BCE, includes provisions to protect a prostitute's inheritance rights, ensuring that if she received property from her father, she could keep it and bequeath it as she pleased. Such laws, which treated prostitutes as a recognized, if lowly, class of women without male protectors, hint at the everyday presence of sex work in ancient cities. Clearly, by the time writing existed, prostitution was already an established part of life, perhaps not literally the oldest profession, but indisputably an ancient one. Sex and the sacred were often intertwined in antiquity. In Mesopotamia and its neighboring lands, fertility goddesses like Ishtar, Inanna, and Ashtar were served by women, and sometimes men, who engaged in sexual rites as a form of worship. The Greek historian Herodotus later claimed that in Babylon, every woman at least once in her life had to sit in the temple of Ishtar and have sex with a stranger as an offering to the goddess of love. Modern scholars doubt it was so universal, but there were indeed temple courtesans in the region, and Herodotus' colorful story reflects a real tradition of sacred prostitution in the Near East. In the Canaanite temples, for example, a significant number of the sacred prostitutes were male, serving male worshippers in honor of the goddess Astarte. Throughout the ancient Near East, these sanctified sex workers, both female and male, were imbued with a mix of reverence and stigma. They performed holy duties by embodying the fertility and pleasure the deities represented, yet outside the ritual context they might be looked down upon. This ambiguity would set a pattern we see again and again in history: prostitution tolerated or even valued for some purposes, but the individuals involved often marginalized. Far to the west on the Nile, the civilization of ancient Egypt had its own approach. The Egyptians, unlike later cultures, did not treat sex itself as shameful. It was seen as a natural part of life, openly celebrated in mythology and fertility rites. Women in ancient Egypt enjoyed relatively high status and independence. They could own property, divorce, and run businesses. So one might imagine that a woman selling intimacy could, at least in theory, do so with a bit more autonomy than her Mesopotamian or Greek counterparts. Egyptian records about prostitution are fragmentary, but they do exist. A few papyrus fragments and stories hint at the presence of professional courtesans and houses of pleasure in Egyptian cities. Unlike Mesopotamia, there is no evidence of formal laws regulating prostitutes or brothels, so prostitution likely operated informally, perhaps through taverns or as an adjunct to entertainment venues. Interestingly, sexuality was woven into Egyptian religious life in other ways. Certain religious celebrations, like the festival of the goddess Atha, involved public songs and rituals extolling sexual joy, and some priestesses of Isis are believed to have engaged in ritual intimacy that outsiders interpreted as a form of sacred prostitution. These were spiritual ceremonies meant to honor the gods, very different from a commercial transaction, yet they show how blurred the line between sacred and sexual could be in Egypt. In day-to-day reality, an Egyptian prostitute might have been indistinguishable from a dancer or a tavern hostess. One Greek account from later antiquity tells of Egyptian women who rowed boats on the Nile, singing and sometimes disrobing to entertain male passengers, a scene suggestive of erotic hospitality. While few direct records of individual Egyptian sex workers survive, their imprint can be found in legal texts, which list adultery and debauchery as offenses, implying prostitutes were around, and in the cautious advice of wisdom literature, warning young men about spending too much time and money in the company of wayward women. So even in the land of the pharaohs, where love poetry was written on papyrus and sexuality had a sacred glow, prostitution quietly took its place in the shadows, its practitioners plying their trade under the warm Egyptian sun with kohl-lined eyes and scented hair, largely unnoticed in the official histories, but undeniably present. Ancient Hebrew writings confirm that prostitution was known in the Levant as well. The Hebrew Bible recounts, without much fanfare, episodes like the story of Judah and Tamar. In that tale, Genesis 38, Tamar, a widow desperate to secure a child, disguises herself and waits by the roadside of Timnah, veiled like a common harlot. Judah, not recognizing his daughter-in-law, takes her for a prostitute and promises her a young goat as payment for her favors. As a pledge until the goat is delivered, she shrewdly demands his seal and staff. The scene is revealing. Tamar covers her face as was customary for prostitutes then, to signal her availability while preserving anonymity. The price she asks, a kid goat, was quite high, affordable only to a man of means, suggesting that sleeping with a prostitute was a luxury for Judah, who was a prosperous herdsman. Another biblical episode centers on Rahab of Jericho, described as a zona, prostitute, living in the city walls of Jericho around the 13th century BCE. When Israelite spies sneak into the city, it is Rahab who receives them, hides them on her roof, and gives them crucial intelligence about Jericho's defenses. Because her profession brought her into contact with travelers and local officials, Rahab was unusually well informed about the town's morale and politics. In exchange for her help, the Israelites spare Rahab and her family during their conquest of the city, and later legends even claim she married into the Israelite community. The Bible doesn't dwell on moralizing about her beyond calling her a harlot, if anything. Rahab is portrayed almost heroically for aiding Joshua's men. These vignettes from Judaic sources illustrate how commonplace prostitution was in the ancient Near East. A woman sitting at a highway crossroad, face covered, awaiting customers. A prostitute's house serving as an impromptu spy headquarters. Such details are mentioned casually, implying that everyone knew these things happened in their world. Moral censure in the text is mild. It was a tolerated part of the social fabric, even if not exactly honored. As we move chronologically into the classical age, the picture of prostitution becomes richer in detail. By the time of the Greek city-states, prostitution had taken on diverse forms, from streetwalkers to sophisticated courtesans. In classical Greece of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, commercial sex was legal, openly practiced, and even occasionally regulated by the state. The great lawgiver Solon of Athens, in the 6th century BCE, is credited with instituting public brothels. The Greek word was oikiskoi, meaning little houses, with set prices so that even the poor could afford their services. According to later writers, Solon used the revenue from these state-controlled brothels to build a new temple to Aphrodite Pandemos, Aphrodite of all the people, goddess of base, earthly love. Whether or not this temple tale is apocryphal, it reflects the Greek view that prostitution, far from hidden, could be harnessed for public benefit. In the bustling port of Corinth, a city famous for its sensuality. The temple of Aphrodite was said to have maintained a troop of 1,000 hierodules, sacred courtesans, who serviced sailors and merchants as a form of offering to the goddess. This number, reported by the geographer Strabo, might be an exaggeration, but there's little doubt Corinth had a thriving sex trade connected to its temples. Everywhere in Greece, one found a stratum of society composed of prostitutes and courtesans, each with their own niche. Common street prostitutes, or porni, often foreign-born or enslaved, might stand in busy agora streets or by the city gates, advertising themselves. Contemporary slang gave them names by their habits: the shamatipoi, ones who strike the ground, who would have sex outdoors on the bare earth with customers; the peripatetics, wandering ones, who cruised the streets and taverns, making deals and then accompanying clients to some private place; or the gephorides, the bridge girls who lingered near bridges at dusk to catch laborious and travelers on their way home. The going rate for a cheap trick in Athens was said to be 1 obol, a tiny silver coin worth about 1/6 of a day's wages for a common worker. In other words, a poor man might part with the price of his dinner or a jug of wine to enjoy a quick encounter with a street girl. Meanwhile, at the other end of the spectrum were the polished hetairi, a word meaning companions. Unlike the lower-class porni, the hetairi were often educated women, usually non-citizens or freed slaves, who provided cultured companionship and sexual intimacy to elite men for high fees. A hetaira would typically grace symposia, drinking parties, engaging in witty conversation, music, and dance, before any more private entertainments occurred. Some became nearly as famous as the politicians and philosophers they mingled with. For example, Aspasia of Miletus, the companion of statesman Pericles, was renowned for her intellect and even taught rhetoric to Socrates. According to some accounts, Greek society accepted that men might seek sexual outlets outside of marriage. Wives were for childbearing and managing the home, while hetairi provided intellectual stimulation and pleasure. There was, therefore, little stigma for the client in visiting a prostitute. Solon himself was praised for saving Athenian men from need by establishing brothels. However, prostitutes themselves occupied a legally and socially liminal space. In Athens, they had to register and pay a tax, and any freeborn woman who worked as a prostitute, or even a freed slave who did so, was barred from later marrying a citizen or taking part in certain religious rites. Men too could be sex sellers in Greece. Many were young adolescent boys, often slaves or very poor youths, who catered to older male patrons in a pederastic context. Male prostitution was common enough that Athens taxed it as well, and authors like Aeschines mention of pornikon telos, a tax on harlots that applied to both sexes. A freeborn boy who prostituted himself, however, would be disgraced and stripped of citizen rights when he grew up, if it became known. This underscores a recurring theme in many societies. Using the services of a prostitute might be acceptable, but being a prostitute, especially if one was a citizen or of higher status, was not. It often meant social death. Still, in practice, Athens tolerated and integrated its sex industry so thoroughly that it became a regular feature of urban life. One can easily imagine an Athenian evening, the marble columns tinted gold by the setting sun, as respectable men drift from the symposium, perhaps slipping down the torchlit side streets where women call out from doorways or boys loiter under lamplight, all part of the hum of the classical city. Following in Greece's footsteps, ancient Rome likewise had a flourishing and frankly acknowledged prostitution industry. Throughout the Roman Republic and Empire, selling sex was legal and widespread, visible in both grand metropolises and provincial towns. Roman society was in some ways even more permissive. Men of the highest social rank, senators, equestrians, could visit brothels or keep prostitutes without grave damage to their reputation, so long as they exercised moderation and did not flaunt their indulgences. Sexual double standards were strong. A respectable Roman woman was expected to be chaste and virtuous, but men were largely free to satisfy their urges as they saw fit, and prostitution provided a convenient outlet. Countless Latin literary works make casual reference to encounters with prostitutes. The poet Horace jokes about topping off a drinking party by hiring a girl for the night. Juvenal, The satirist grimly describes noble matrons sneaking out to work in disguise at brothels out of depraved excitement. These may be exaggerations, but real-life evidence abounds as well. The city of Pompeii, buried by Vesuvius in 79 CE, offers a snapshot. Archaeologists have found at least one purpose-built brothel there, the Lupana, containing small stone cubicles with a raised masonry bed in each, where prostitutes and clients did their business. Faint erotic frescoes still adorn the walls of the Pompeii brothel, presumably as a kind of menu of services or simply decoration for titillation. Meanwhile, graffiti scrawled by soldiers and travelers give crude accounts of who was with whom, how much it cost, and how good or bad the experience was. From such remnants, we know sex was fully part of the fabric of daily Roman life. Legally, Roman authorities took a characteristically bureaucratic approach. Prostitution was lawful but regulated. A woman who wished to be a recognized prostitute and not risk certain criminal charges was expected to register with the local aedile, magistrate, and have her name entered on the roll of meretrices. A meretrix, literally earning woman, then paid taxes on her income. Those who practiced clandestinely without registering were simply called prostibuli, a catch-all term for streetwalkers and unlicensed harlots. There was no punishment for being a prostibula per se, except if caught in adultery or something similar, but being unregistered meant one was outside whatever limited legal protections the law afforded. And what were those protections? Not many. Roman prostitutes, even licensed, belonged to a class of people labeled infames, essentially shameful people. Gladiators, actors, and prostitutes all fell under this category. Stripped of the normal legal standing enjoyed by citizens, they could not testify in court or hold civic office. Their word was often considered less credible. Most Roman prostitutes were of low social origin. Many were slaves or former slaves from the far-flung provinces, brought to Rome in chains or born into servitude and put to work in brothels. Others were free but destitute women, often widows or impoverished migrants, doing what they could to survive. There were also higher-class courtesans in Rome, sophisticated court prostitutes who mingled with the wealthy. Some even became affluent themselves. The historian Tacitus mentions a freedwoman courtesan who owned a grand tomb, and there were famed courtesans like Scylla and Celadon who were the mistresses of powerful men. But by and large, the life of a Roman prostitute was harsh. Still, Roman pragmatism prevailed, as long as brothels and streetwalkers kept to certain areas and did not disrupt public order. The authorities were content to let commerce continue. In fact, late in the imperial era, 4th century CE, when Christianity was spreading but before it gained total dominance, records hint that some huge brothels in Rome had become quasi-public institutions, even advertised in guidebooks of the day as curiosities for visitors. Some scholars speculate these might have been under a measure of state control, a continuation of the idea that regulating the sex trade was better than trying to stamp it out. Interestingly, Roman religion, like that of the Greeks, found a small ceremonial place for prostitutes. Every April, Rome celebrated the festival of Venus Verticordia and the Floralia, during which prostitutes danced and acted on stage, sometimes shedding clothes as part of the revelry, to honor Venus, the patroness of love. It was thought that during these festivals, the pleasure-givers of the city paid homage to the goddess, perhaps hoping for her favor and forgiving. Yet despite this toleration and even integration, Romans were often morally conflicted about prostitution. The same man who casually visited a brothel might declare that infames were corrupt and low. This ambivalence is captured by the Romans saying that prostitutes were, like the saws in a palace, dirty but necessary to keep the whole house clean. Society needed them so that respectable women would be left alone. Thus, in the Roman mind, prostitution was an ever-present necessary vice, legally permitted, widely used, but always a little shameful, a shadow realm where pleasure and degradation met. By the late antique period, a profound shift was underway. The rise of Christianity in the 4th century CE brought new moral perspectives that would reshape attitudes toward prostitution for centuries to come. In 324 CE, Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor, outlawed the cult of Venus and other pagan practices, effectively ending the tradition of sacred prostitution in the Mediterranean world. The public temples where sex had been offered to gods were closed or destroyed. Henceforth, sexual commerce would be seen less as a religious rite and more purely as sin or vice. Yet even the church's leading thinkers recognized the difficulty of eliminating the trade. St. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the early 5th century, famously urged tolerance toward prostitution as a lesser evil. If you expel prostitution from society, you will unsettle everything on account of lust, he warned. Augustine compared prostitutes to a filth that, if not contained in the sewers, would spread everywhere, echoing that grudging Roman notion of necessity. Thus, while Christian doctrine condemned extramarital sex, many theologians reluctantly agreed that tolerating prostitutes might protect respectable women and prevent worse offenses. After the Western Roman Empire fell, in the early Middle Ages, prostitution did not disappear, far from it. With the decline of slavery in Europe, fewer slaves meant fewer women being coercively prostituted by owners. Many prostitutes in medieval Europe were poor free women who drifted into the trade for lack of other means. Throughout medieval towns, especially as urban life revived around the 12th century, prostitutes were a common sight. They worked in city bathhouses, in taverns, or in rented rooms at the edge of towns. The church's stance during the medieval era was complex. Officially, all sex outside marriage was a damnable offense, and paying for sex was certainly a sin. However, secular authorities, with church acquiescence, often chose to regulate rather than eradicate prostitution. Civic leaders perceived that men would seek these services regardless, so it was pragmatic to contain the trade. In many places, brothels were actually licensed by town governments. For example, by the High Middle Ages, southern European cities like Venice, Florence, and Toulouse had established municipally-run brothels, a designated city bordello, where prostitutes could work for set fees under the watch of a government-appointed manager. This allowed authorities to confine the activity to certain districts and profit by taxing it. In Northern Europe, a slightly different model emerged. Prostitutes were often tolerated only outside the city walls, in suburbs or just beyond the town boundaries. City councils would decree that no woman of ill repute could solicit within the fortified town. Instead, they congregated in extramural zones, ironically nicknamed things like Paradise Gardens or Valley of Pleasure. Townsfolk and travelers knew that just outside the gate you might find a line of brothels or bathhouses ready to serve. This extraterritorial tolerance sometimes existed because the city's laws technically didn't apply beyond the walls, or simply because the city fathers could claim prostitution wasn't happening under their roof while still benefiting from its presence nearby. A famous case was Southwark on the outskirts of London, home to the Stews, a district of bathhouse brothels along the Thames. These brothels were not under London city jurisdiction, but rather under the authority, almost unbelievably, of the Bishop of Winchester. The church-owned land in Southwark allowed the bishop to license and tax the brothels, and indeed the bishops of Winchester drew considerable income from this trade for centuries, even as they publicly decried the sin. This hypocrisy gave rise to the term Winchester geese for the prostitutes there, and if a woman died in the stew she might be buried in a single women's churchyard, a potter's field unconsecrated by the church despite the church's profit from her work. Thus medieval prostitution often existed in a legal limbo, frowned upon but semi-officially maintained. Municipal records from many European towns list payments made to fix up the town brothel or to subsidize a madam, alongside ordinances forbidding prostitutes from wearing certain luxurious clothes or from appearing unduly within polite society. They were usually required to don identifying garments, perhaps a striped hood or a distinctive badge, marking them as women of the trade if they ventured out. Periodically, waves of reform or fear would cause crackdowns. Monastic reformers preaching in a city might stir up townsfolk to expel all whores. Sometimes, severe outbreaks of disease were blamed on prostitutes. Notably, after 1348, the Black Death's trauma led some to scapegoat immoral behavior. Brothels in London were closed temporarily in the plague's wake, only to quietly reopen later. And in the late 15th century, a new deadly sexually transmitted disease, syphilis, erupted in Europe, first noted widely in 1494. Syphilis spread rapidly and was often fatal in its early outbreak. It was nicknamed the Great Pox, as syphilis ravaged armies and civilians alike. authorities became far less tolerant of prostitution, which they saw as a vector of infection. This coincided with the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation in the 16th century, religious movements that both stressed personal moral purity. Between the fear of disease and the zeal of reformers, many of the old licensed brothels were shut down across Europe by the mid-1500s. In some Protestant cities like Geneva, being a prostitute or a client became a serious crime. In Catholic realms, church and state authorities also enforced harsh measures, though often inconsistently. It was in this period that prostitution, once grudgingly accepted as necessary, came to be seen more uniformly as a social ill to be stamped out for the sake of public order and health. Still, despite laws and louder moral condemnation, the trade lived on underground. Streetwalkers, clandestine brothels, and courtesans attached to noble courts continued to flourish in new guises. The truth was that the demand for sexual services did not disappear. It merely became more hidden, and the people selling sex were pushed further into the margins or underworld, often subject to greater exploitation since they no longer had even the limited legal protections once offered. Beyond Christendom, in the medieval Islamic world, prostitution also persisted in tension with morality, albeit under different terms. Islam explicitly forbids zina, fornication or adultery, and prostitution is considered a grave sin in Islamic law. The Prophet Muhammad is recorded to have cursed those who profit from money earned by prostitution, putting the earnings of a pimp in the same category as the sale of dogs or idolatry. So officially, there was no tolerance for running brothels or open solicitation in Sharia-based governance. However, in practice, medieval Muslim societies did see prostitution occur, often under the radar or in socially sanctioned disguise. One significant factor was slavery. Islamic law, while forbidding prostitution, allowed men to have sexual relations with their female slaves, concubines. This loophole meant that some prostitution was effectively channeled through the institution of slavery. Slave women, often of foreign origin, Europeans, Africans, or Central Asians captured or purchased, might be offered to guests or even rented out for income by their owners. This was a gray area. Technically, an owner was not supposed to pimp out a slave for money, but the line could blur, and records show it happened. For instance, in the cosmopolitan Abbasid city of Baghdad, 9th to 10th centuries, there were markets of singing girls and courtesans who were legally slaves but in effect acted as high-end prostitutes or entertainers for hire. Many were trained in music, poetry, and the erotic arts to please wealthy patrons at court. In the Ottoman Empire, 14th to 19th centuries, which inherited these Islamic traditions, prostitution was entwined with both slavery and the multi-religious makeup of society. Ottoman records speak of brothels in cities like Istanbul and Izmir. Officially, operating a brothel was illegal, yet authorities often turned a blind eye or quietly licensed such establishments in districts inhabited by non-Muslims. In many Ottoman port cities, European observers in the 18th century remarked on Frankish, European, prostitutes catering to sailors, as well as local Greek, Armenian, or Jewish women engaged in sex work. Muslim women involved in prostitution tended to be disguised as dancers or masseuses. Some were likely courtesans under temporary marriage contracts, matay in Shia Islam, or similarly the Sunni concept of misyar marriages today, which made their arrangements technically a form of marriage rather than prostitution. This was another loophole. A short-term marriage could be made for the duration of a man's stay in town, dissolved after he left, essentially a religiously permitted one-night stand. Over time, brothel quarters became established in major Middle Eastern cities, sometimes with tacit acceptance. In the Ottoman Turkish archives, one finds evidence that male prostitution was present too. Young men called kocheks, often adolescent boys dressed as girls, danced in coffee houses and bathhouses and sometimes took male lovers or clients, a practice that scandalized conservative observers but persisted as a form of entertainment. By the 19th century, Ottoman officials, under pressure to modernize, tried to reform these practices. The empire issued regulations. For example, an 1889 law explicitly banning the prostitution of female slaves, a sign that it was happening and needed addressing. But also, around that time, fully commercial brothels became state-regulated in places like Egypt and Ottoman Tunisia, adopting the European model of licensing and weekly medical checks for prostitutes. Thus, throughout the Islamic realm, there was a constant push and pull, religious doctrine pulled toward abolition and severe punishment. Some interpretations of Sharia prescribed flogging or even death for repeat offenders, while social and economic forces pushed toward toleration and unofficial regulation. As in the West, those caught in the middle were the prostitutes themselves, often drawn from the most vulnerable groups: slaves, impoverished widows or girls, religious or ethnic minorities living on the fringes of approval. Back in South Asia, prostitution evolved along its own distinctive path. Ancient India had a long-standing tradition of courtesans and eroticism openly discussed in literature and law. The earliest Indian scriptures, the Vedas, till 1500–500 BCE, mention women called Ganikas, courtesans of refined skill, suggesting that by Vedic times an institutional form of sex work already existed. Unlike a street prostitute, a Ganika was often an accomplished performer, adept in singing, music, and the art of love. They might perform at royal courts or religious festivals. Indeed, some were associated with temples. Early on, certain women served in temples as dancers and musicians for the gods, a role that likely included sexual liaisons with human patrons as well. By the 4th century BCE, we have clear evidence of state-regulated prostitution in India. The famous treatise Arthashastra, written by the strategist Chanakya, Kautilya, advisor to Emperor Chandragupta, contains an entire chapter on the duties of the superintendent of prostitutes. This official was tasked with overseeing courtesans, known also as rupajivas, literally livelihood from beauty, in the royal city. According to these guidelines, courtesans were registered, given protection, and required to report their earnings and pay a portion as tax to the treasury. They were expected to be available for state occasions and to spy for the king when needed, since their interactions with powerful men could yield valuable intelligence. The Arthashastra portrays courtesans almost as civil servants. They even received a salary or retainer from the state in some cases. It also outlines fines for pimps and punishments for anyone caught exploiting a courtesan against her will, indicating an attempt, at least on paper, to protect these women and control the trade's excesses. During the Maurya and Gupta empires, c. 320 BCE, 550 CE, top-tier courtesans in cities like Patalipatra and Ujjain were cultivated. Respected figures, moving with grace in elite circles, they were known for their wit, education, and even philanthropy. Some founded temples or donated to public works. Sanskrit drama and poetry from those eras frequently feature courtesans as characters, revealing a complex mix of admiration and pity for them. Parallel to this secular tradition, India also nurtured the unique institution of the Devadasi, or servant of the god, from around the 6th century CE onward, peaking by the 10th to 12th centuries. Certain Hindu temples, particularly in the south, would dedicate young girls to the deity. These Devadasis were trained in sacred dance, like Bharatnatyam, and music, to perform daily in the temple and at festivals. They enjoyed high status for a time, respected as married to the god, not bound to a mortal husband, and often patronized by kings and nobles who gave generous gifts to the temple in exchange for their performances. However, the Devadasi system had a carnal side. Many Devadasis, after reaching puberty, became the courtesans of wealthy benefactors or temple priests. It was understood that they would sexually entertain donors who were helping the temple financially. In theory, this was a sacred duty and not mere prostitution. In practice, the lines were very thin. Devadasis did not marry, and their children often followed them into the same profession. Over centuries, especially under British colonial scrutiny in the 19th century, the Devadasi tradition came to be viewed as nothing more than religiously sanctioned prostitution, a sanctified prostitute as one British commentator called them. Social reformers in India eventually outlawed the Devadasi system in the 20th century, but echoes of it remained, even into the 21st century. Impoverished families in some regions still secretly dedicate daughters to this fate, despite the practice being illegal. Meanwhile, Medieval India also saw the evolution of the Tawaif culture. Tawaifs were the elegant courtesans of the Mughal era, 16th to 18th centuries, especially flourishing in the north. In cities like Delhi, Agra, and Lucknow, they were masters of etiquette, poetry, often versed in Urdu and Persian literature, music, and dance. Their salons, kotas, were frequented by nawabs, nobles, poets, and even emperors. Sex might be part of the relationship, but the Tawaif's primary role was to entertain and flatter the male ego in genteel fashion. In fact, some Tawaifs became kingmakers and astute businesswomen. The most sought after could choose their lovers or refuse any patron who didn't meet their standards. They sometimes trained younger girls and boys in the arts, perpetuating a refined culture of courtesanship that contributed immensely to Indian music and dance forms. The British, arriving in India, were at once fascinated and scandalized by the Tawaifs. They often lumped them together with common prostitutes, failing to appreciate the cultural nuance. And by the late 19th century, colonial laws too began to crack down on these courtesans under anti-prostitution campaigns, a move that Indian historians lament as a loss to art and culture, as much as a moral reform. Continuing our journey eastward and into later periods, we find that China and Japan also developed complex systems around the sex trade. In ancient China, prostitution was present from early times, though records are spotty. By the imperial Han Dynasty, around the time of Christ, there were government-registered prostitutes who entertained officials. The court historian Sima Qian even records an empress complaining about her husband's dalliances with singing girls. But it was much later, in the Ming 1368 to 1644 and Qing 1644 to 1912 dynasties, that Chinese prostitution reached a grand-scale organization. The bustling cities of the late imperial era, Beijing, Nanjing, Suzhou, Hangzhou, Canton, Shanghai, all had well-known pleasure quarters. These quarters, often located on a particular street or section of town, were a world unto themselves, with brothels ranked by class. At the top were the elegant courtesans, sometimes called Qinglu girls, after the blue chambers where they received guests. Such women were akin to the Japanese geisha or Indian Tawaif. They were well versed in the arts, could converse on poetry or politics, play musical instruments, and pour tea gracefully. In addition to providing intimacy, they might spend weeks courting a wealthy patron before consummating, all the while charging him for each visit of music and flirtation. These elite courtesans often avoided public sight, appearing only within designated entertainment houses or being rowed in covered boats to rendezvous on lantern-lit lake pavilions. Their lives were romanticized in Chinese literature as bittersweet, full of love affairs with scholars and tragic partings. Below them were mid-tier brothels with plainer women providing more straightforward services. And at the bottom were the street prostitutes, women of the people, sometimes called jiao or wild chickens in slang. They openly solicited after dusk, hanging around tea shops, wine houses, or the theater district at night to catch customers. In the early evening, as one Chinese account from the 1800s describes, the willow branches stir and the songbirds cry, a poetic allusion, and out come the women of the flower alleys, meaning the prostitutes leaving their cramped quarters and fanning out into the streets under the paper lanterns to seek business. Chinese authorities, influenced by Confucian disdain for licentiousness, often wrote edicts against prostitution. Some emperors periodically ordered brothels shut down and prostitutes rehabilitated. For instance, the Yongjing emperor in 1720 supposedly issued such an edict, yet enforcement was inconsistent. Local officials were sometimes clients themselves, or saw tolerance as a way to keep peace. Better the men amuse themselves with prostitutes than stir up trouble. Additionally, prostitution in China was not only for male-female encounters. There was a known demand for male prostitutes, usually young effeminate men or adolescents, serving male clientele, especially during the Qing era. Though it was kept more secret, the existence of these roles was acknowledged in legal texts which occasionally mention punishment for male brothel keepers. In sum, by the end of the 19th century, China's trade in sex was thriving even as the empire itself crumbled. Every treaty port had its brothel quarter, frequented by locals and foreign sailors alike. In fact, Foreign involvement started to shape this history too. The term yellow slave traffic emerged to describe how Japanese and Chinese women were trafficked around Asia, from Japan and coastal China to cities like Singapore, Hong Kong, Manila, and beyond, to serve in brothels catering largely to migrant laborers and sailors. Japanese women known as Karayuki-san, literally Miss Gone Abroad, were sent by brokers to Southeast Asia and the Pacific in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, forming extensive networks of Asian prostitution outside their homelands. Some Chinese women were similarly deceived or sold into overseas prostitution, as were some European women sent to the Orient, the notorious white slave traffic. Japan developed one of the most formalized and stratified systems of prostitution, especially during the Edo period, 1603 to 1868. In the early 17th century, the Tokugawa shogunate, seeking to impose order, confined prostitution to licensed districts in major cities. The most famous of these was the Yoshiwara in Edo, present-day Tokyo, a walled pleasure quarter just north of the city. Similar districts existed in Kyoto, the Shimabara, and Osaka, the Shinmachi. Within their gates, the floating world, Ukiyo, of entertainment flourished. By shogunal law, no brothels could operate outside these quarters, and within them, every woman had to be registered. The hierarchy of Japanese courtesans was elaborate. At the pinnacle stood the oiran, high-ranking courtesans celebrated for their beauty, artistry, and refinement. An oiran was not just a prostitute. She was an entertainer extraordinaire, dressed in sumptuous silk kimono with towering wooden clogs and an elaborate hairstyle bedecked with ornaments. An oiran would parade through the streets of Yoshiwara attended by servants, almost like a noble lady, to meet a favored client. Among the oiran, the very highest rank was called tei, women so select that only the wealthiest lords and merchants could afford even an evening in their company. The tei and oiran performed music, playing the shamisen, composed witty poems, excelled in calligraphy and tea ceremony. Essentially, they were the art connoisseurs of love. A first-time patron might spend a small fortune and several visits just to be granted the privilege of sitting in the same room and talking with a tei. Sexual consummation, if it happened at all, came only after a rigorous courting ritual. These courtesans became trendsetters. Woodblock prints of famous oiran were sold in the thousands, and ordinary women copied their fashion and hairstyle. The last true tei of the Yoshiwara retired in the 1760s, marking the end of that golden age. But the courtesan culture carried on in slightly less exalted forms into the 19th century. Below the oiran were ranks of lesser prostitutes, collectively called ijo, playgirls, who serviced the more everyday customers, and distinct from these was the later development of the geisha. Contrary to popular belief, geisha were not part of the hierarchy of prostitutes. In fact, the profession arose in the 18th century partly to cater to men's desire for refined female company when courtesans became too expensive or rare. Geisha were professional entertainers. The word means arts person who performed music, dance, and conversation. While a geisha might have romantic or sexual relationships, it was not contractual guaranteed as part of her job. In many cases, sex with clients was off the table for geisha, distinguishing them from courtesans. The confusion came because both geisha and courtesans inhabited the same flower and willow world and often performed together at parties. Think of it this way: in a Yoshiwara tea house, a wealthy merchant might hire a geisha to sing and play the shamisen during dinner, and separately negotiate with a ijo or courtesan for the night, two different services. This nuance notwithstanding, all these women, geisha, oiran, common ijo, contributed to Japan's vibrant nightlife and were a cornerstone of urban culture in the Edo period. Their equivalents for lower classes existed too. Unlicensed street prostitutes roamed outside city quarters at their peril, and in rural hot springs or post towns, one could find onsen geisha or meshimori onna, serving women who were essentially prostitutes catering to travelers. As Japan opened to the world in the late 19th century, this extensive sex industry became a point of fascination and exploitation by outsiders. As mentioned, European and Asian entrepreneurs trafficked Japanese women abroad, and likewise some foreign women found themselves in Asian brothels. By the early 20th century, reformers in Japan were also questioning these traditions. leading to gradual changes, but not before the country's militaristic turn would produce one of the most infamous chapters in prostitution's history. That chapter came during World War II, in the 1930s and 40s. As Imperial Japan rampaged across Asia, the Japanese military set up a system of military brothels to service its troops. This was rationalized as a way to prevent random rape and sexually transmitted diseases among soldiers. Tragically, it involved the forced prostitution of an estimated 200,000 women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied lands. These women are known by the haunting euphemism comfort women. They were often deceived or coerced into sexual slavery, held in comfort stations and near the front lines, and subjected to relentless abuse. The term obscures the brutality of what they endured. Decades later, the few who survived spoke out, describing how they were treated as commodities by the army. This state-sponsored wartime atrocity highlighted the extreme end of prostitution spectrum, a form of mass coercion tied directly to militarism and conquest. Sadly, other armies in World War II also utilized brothels, though not usually forced on that scale. For example, the German Wehrmacht ran field brothels in occupied Europe with women, often unwilling, rounded up from camps. And Allied soldiers in liberated France formed long queues at tolerated red light areas in Paris. War has a way of bringing out both the demand for sexual services and the exploitation that can attend it. If the first half of the 20th century was marked by war and the global movement of sex workers, often involuntary, the second half saw the issue of prostitution framed increasingly as one of law, rights, and public health. In the early 1900s, reformers around the world had already been campaigning against the regulated brothel systems that many countries had in the 19th century. For instance, Britain's Contagious Diseases Act, which had allowed police to detain any woman suspected of being a prostitute in garrison towns and force her to undergo invasive medical exams, were repealed by 1886 after a loud feminist outcry. France eventually abolished its state brothels, the maisons closes, after World War II. Under pressure from abolitionists who saw the system as oppressive, an international consensus seemed to emerge that prostitution was a social evil to be suppressed. A 1949 United Nations Convention on Human Trafficking essentially urged countries to ban brothels and stop punishing prostitutes who were seen as victims, but to keep pimping and procurement illegal. In the United States, vice crusaders had succeeded between 1910 and 1915 in criminalizing prostitution in virtually every state. The once rowdy red light districts of the Wild West and port cities were steadily shut down. Even famously tolerant enclaves like Storyville in New Orleans, where jazz music had flourished in bordellos, was ordered closed by federal mandate in 1917 as America entered World War I. The impetus was partly moral and partly practical. The U.S. military, in World War I, was terrified of its troops contracting venereal disease. So under what was called the American Plan, U.S. authorities did something ironically similar to the old Contagious Diseases Acts. They gave law enforcement sweeping power to detain and examine any woman found within a certain distance of a military base or camp who was suspected of promiscuity or prostitution. During World War I, in towns near training camps, thousands of women, many simply young and independent-minded, not necessarily prostitutes, were forced into quarantine hospitals or farm colonies if they tested positive for syphilis or gonorrhea. This American plan continued in various forms on the home front into the 1920s and 30s, and even into the 40s during World War II, disproportionately targeting working-class and minority women under the guise of protecting soldiers. Such measures show the recurring theme of public health fears shaping prostitution policy. After World War II, with the advent of antibiotics, the worst of syphilis and gonorrhea could be cured, easing some panic. Yet, new concerns arose as the 20th century progressed. The spread of HIV/AIDS in the 1980s reignited calls to control or reach out to sex workers for public safety. And later, the specter of human trafficking, the modern term for involuntary prostitution, became a focus of international law enforcement. By the late 20th century, The world's approaches to prostitution diverged into roughly two camps: prohibition abolition versus legalization decriminalization, with a few hybrid models in between. In much of the United States and many other countries, a strict prohibition model held sway. Selling sex, buying sex, or both were criminal offenses, except for a few regulated jurisdictions like certain counties in Nevada. In contrast, places like the Netherlands, in 2000, and Germany, in 2002, fully legalized and regulated prostitution, aiming to treat it as a legitimate economic activity. Legal brothels opened in Amsterdam's neon-lit windows and Berlin's apartment blocks, with sex workers entitled to medical checkups and employment benefits. However, even these systems had struggles. Germany, for instance, tried to institute a registration system in 2017 requiring all sex workers to register with the government, but fewer than 1% complied. Many feared stigma, loss of privacy, or simply did not trust authorities to protect them. On the other hand, a novel approach emerged first in Sweden in 1999, the so-called Nordic model, which decriminalizes selling sex but criminalizes buying it. The idea is to treat prostitutes as victims, not punishing them, while penalizing clients and pimps in order to reduce demand. Sweden's experiment saw street prostitution decline, at least initially, and inspired Norway, Iceland, Canada, France, Ireland and others to adopt similar laws in the 2000s and 2010s. Critics argue this model still pushes sex work into the shadows, while proponents claim it's a step toward ending exploitation. Meanwhile, in 2003, New Zealand took perhaps the most progressive stance. It decriminalized prostitution completely, removing all criminal penalties for consensual adult sex work and focusing on health and safety regulations. This effectively made prostitution a normal, if still stigmatized, job in New Zealand, with some positive outcomes reported, such as sex workers being more willing to report crimes against them. Throughout these debates, the voices of sex workers themselves grew louder. A global sex worker rights movement blossomed from the 1970s onward, arguing under the slogan "Sex work is work." Activists like Carol Lee, who coined the term sex work, and groups like the English Collective of Prostitutes or India's Durbar Mahila Samanwaya Committee insisted that consensual adult prostitutes deserved labor rights, protection from violence, and an end to social stigma. They reframed the narrative. Rather than fallen women or public nuisances, they presented sex workers as individuals making pragmatic choices in difficult circumstances, often to support families, and deserving of dignity and legal standing. At the same time, other advocates, many from feminist and religious organizations, vehemently opposed normalizing prostitution. To them, prostitution was inherently tied to the oppression of women, and in some cases, children and trans individuals too. They pointed out that throughout history, the vast majority of those selling sex have done so out of economic duress, lack of alternatives, or coercion, not because it was an empowering career choice. In this view, prostitution could never be truly consensual in a world with gender inequality. It was labeled a form of violence against women that society should aim to eliminate, not integrate. This philosophical divide, empowerment vs. exploitation, continues to color discussions of prostitution policy today. The late 20th and early 21st century also saw new facets of the sex trade. The rise of the internet changed how prostitution operates in many places. Solicitation moved from dim street corners to online classifieds and encrypted messaging apps. A client might now browse profiles on a website rather than cruise a red light district. This made the trade less visible on the streets but presented new challenges in policing and outreach, and sparked debates about online platforms' liability for hosting sex ads. Another phenomenon was the growth of sex tourism, travelers from wealthier countries flying to poorer regions specifically to buy sex, attracted by lower prices or fewer legal risks. In the late 20th century, destinations like Thailand, the Philippines, the Caribbean, or Eastern Europe became known for catering to foreign sex tourists, raising ethical issues of economic disparity and potential exploitation. One author estimated, perhaps with exaggeration, that as many as 3 in 4 Western men visiting parts of Asia or Africa had paid for sex on their trip. While hard numbers are elusive, Sex tourism undeniably became a globalized part of the industry, with entire local economies in some towns geared towards it. Simultaneously, international crime syndicates took advantage of open borders to traffic individuals across continents into prostitution. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, for instance, thousands of women from Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltics were recruited, sometimes under false pretenses, and sent to brothels in Western Europe, the Middle East, notably the Gulf states, and Asia. Eastern European women became a significant presence in the brothels of Italy, Germany, Israel, and Dubai in the 1990s and 2000s. Likewise, women from rural Asia or Africa were moved to big cities or overseas. This modern human trafficking is often described as a new slave trade, though its magnitude and the balance between forced vs. voluntary migration in sex work are hotly debated. Efforts to combat trafficking have been a rare point of agreement between otherwise opposed factions. All agree that forced prostitution is abhorrent, though they may disagree on how to distinguish coercion from choice in many cases. Looking over this long history, from the sacred harlots of Sumer to the high-tech escort agencies of today, one cannot help but notice cyclical patterns and enduring themes. Economically, prostitution has often thrived in times and places of significant wealth gaps or where large numbers of men are separated from women, frontier mining camps, ports, army bases, big cities with migrant labor forces, etc. The story of Deadwood or Dawson City in the 19th century Wild West, for example, was one of boomtowns teeming with single miners and cowboys, where enterprising madams set up brothels and did a brisk trade until the law eventually intervened. In those rough towns, prostitutes sometimes achieved a kind of respect as frontier necessities. Their parlors were places of music and merriment in an otherwise harsh environment. Some even became local legends, like the brothel district of Storyville in New Orleans, which, before its closure, was a cradle of jazz and a social leveler where men of all classes came to relax. Socially and culturally, the role of the prostitute has been full of contradictions. At times she, or he, is invisible, a person without identity or voice, as seen in so many historical records where prostitutes' names go unmentioned, their presence only inferred from laws or sermons. Other times, the prostitute is highly visible, a celebrity courtesan, an inspiration for art and literature. Think of Madame du Barry at Versailles, or the courtesan Vasantasena in ancient Indian drama, or the painted beauties of ukiyo-e prints. Society has by turns reviled and romanticized these figures. The Victorians, for instance, publicly condemned prostitutes as fallen women, diseased. Yet in private the demand from Victorian gentlemen was so high that tens of thousands of women worked in London's clandestine brothels. The contradictions often reveal double standards. Men's sexual desires have been grudgingly accommodated throughout history, while women, or others, who satisfy those desires for compensation have been stigmatized. Religion has played a huge role in shaping perceptions, from sanctifying sexual service in temples to denouncing it as the devil's work. Yet, interestingly, the major religions often arrived at a similar pragmatic acceptance. Medieval Islam and Christianity, despite their doctrinal differences, both ended up informally tolerating prostitution for centuries because outright suppression was either too difficult or thought to cause worse disorders. Law and policy toward prostitution have swung like a pendulum. Regulate and tax it in one era, outlaw and punish it in the next, then back again. These shifts usually correspond to larger societal changes, a new moral philosophy, a public health crisis, a political upheaval, or a human rights movement. And underlying it all are the human stories, the individuals who have sold sex and those who have bought it. Prostitution is a very intimate transaction wrapped up in a lot of social baggage. At the heart of it is something profoundly human, the exchange of pleasure, comfort, or at times mere bodily release, for something of value. For some prostitutes through history, this exchange brought a degree of independence or influence they could not have otherwise had, the famed courtesans who wielded power over kings, or simply a poor woman who managed to support herself and maybe her children by this work in a rigid society that offered her no other income. For many others, it was a life of hardship, coercion, or sorrow, the comfort woman brutalized in a war, the young girl sold by her family in 19th century Paris, the boy forced into botchabazi in Afghanistan with no say in his fate. Even in the best cases, the profession has carried a stigma that separates sex workers from the rest of society. They often live a dual existence, tolerated or even needed for certain functions, but marginalized and shamed in the broader culture. In modern times, we are still grappling with the legacy of this oldest profession. The historical record gives no easy answer to whether prostitution is primarily a story of oppression or empowerment. In truth, it has been both, and everything in between, depending on the context and the individual. What it does tell us is that prostitution has been astonishingly persistent. Through every major epoch and every major culture, it finds a way to adapt. When societies are permissive, it operates in the open, sometimes with pomp and celebration. When societies are repressive, it goes underground, perhaps into dark alleyways or behind digital screens, but it does not disappear. This tenacity forces us to reflect on why. Perhaps it speaks to fundamental aspects of human society, disparities in power and wealth, collective attitudes towards sex, and the simple reality of sexual desire that might not always be fulfilled within the strict bounds of marriage or propriety. Prostitutes historically have met a demand that, moral judgments aside, has always existed, whether for physical release, emotional connection, or the allure of the forbidden. As we reach the end of this long chronicle, one might ask, what does the history of prostitution say about us, about human society? It serves as a kind of mirror. In each era, how prostitutes were treated, be it with reverence, indifference, exploitation, or compassion, reflects that era's broader values and power structures. In societies where women had few rights and were seen as property, we often see prostitution in its most exploitative, brutal forms, slavery and forced concubinage. In societies more open to women's agency or more secular in outlook, we sometimes see prostitutes able to assert themselves as entrepreneurs or cultural influencers. The shifts in legal regimes show evolving notions of public morality and state responsibility. At times the state says we will manage this pragmatically. At other times we must save or purify society by banning this. Neither approach ever definitively solves the issue, because ultimately, prostitution isn't a problem to solve in a simple sense, but a complex social phenomenon that interweaves with economics, gender, and sexuality. Today, attitudes continue to evolve. Some countries and communities have moved toward viewing sex workers as individuals deserving labor rights and protection from violence, a significant departure from millennia of viewing them as inherently tainted. Elsewhere, crackdowns and punitive laws have returned under new moral or nationalist impulses, and the debate remains emotionally charged. One side may invoke the courtesans of history, the literature and art inspired by them, or the argument that consenting adults have the right to transact sex just like any other service. The other side may invoke the victims of trafficking, the centuries of abuse, or the argument that prostitution by its nature reduces a person, usually a woman, to a commodity, reinforcing inequalities. History provides evidence for both perspectives. One can find stories of agency and dignity, and stories of degradation and suffering. Recognizing this duality might be key to a more humane understanding. In a thoughtful, neutral light, the kind we've tried to maintain in this narrative, prostitution's long story is neither to glamorize nor to demonize, but to understand. It tells us that human sexuality does not fit neatly into the boxes that moral codes often try to impose. It tells us that whenever there are imbalances of money, of power, of freedom, some will seek to capitalize on the most intimate of human acts, and others will be left bearing the consequences. And it also tells us that those labeled as fallen or deviant are still, in the end, simply people trying to survive, to carve out a bit of autonomy, or perhaps to find moments of connection in a world that has often been unkind to them. The history of the world's oldest profession is thus deeply entwined with the history of human civilization itself, from the campfires of prehistory to the neon lights of a modern red light district. Across temples and taverns, palaces and slums, it has persisted, adapting to every era's norms and challenges. As we conclude this long journey through time, we might take a moment to reflect on what this endurance means. Perhaps it teaches humility, that human nature, with its desires and flaws, consistently defies our attempts at perfect order. Perhaps it elicits empathy for those who have walked this path throughout time, often unseen, each with their own story. And certainly, it reminds us that history is not only made by kings and heroes, but also by those in the shadows, the marginalized, whose lives nonetheless touch on every facet of society from economy to religion to family life. In the quiet of the night, as this narrative softly winds down, we consider how much has changed around prostitution and yet how much remains the same. The specifics of temple rites or Victorian laws may belong to the past, but the fundamental questions persist. How should society balance individual choice versus protection from exploitation? Is sex work just work or something intrinsically different? Can a line be drawn between voluntary and forced? And who gets to draw it? These are questions societies around the world are still debating, with no easy answers in sight. But armed with knowledge of this long history, we have a richer context to inform the discussion. We see that perception has swung like a pendulum, from times when prostitution was integrated into sacred and civic life, to times when it was driven into the gutters. And with each swing, we learn something about our collective psyche, our fears, our hypocrisies, our pragmatism, and our capacity for empathy or lack thereof. One day, perhaps, the story will take a new turn that finally resolves these tensions, or perhaps it will simply continue, as ancient and as human as ever. For now, prostitution remains what it has always been, the complex, multifaceted reality that has outlived empires and religions, carrying forward the oldest of dialogues between desire and commerce. In its very endurance lies a lesson about the resilience of certain human conditions. And so, as we end our tale, we do so on a reflective note. The long continuum of history fades into the present, and we recognize that the tale of the oldest profession is ultimately a tale about human society itself, ever-changing, yet often coming full circle, capable of both compassionate understanding and harsh judgment. It is a story that, much like the profession it describes, has no clear end in sight, but ever so gently invites understanding as we drift into contemplation, and finally, into sleep.